You're listening to Dead Air Podcast, part of Splatterpictures.net.
What's up, everybody? Wes, Dead Air Knipe here with Always.
Typical Lydia.
Today's show, we're going to be doing the 2002 remake classic, The Ring. 7 days.
I'm getting deja vu. I mean, it was 7 days not too long ago, was it? Not when we did the original.
I'm seeing double 4 Ring movies. Yeah, it's fun to do this. I initially was a little worried because I had thought that the films are so similar that we're going to be retreading the conversation quite a bit. But I do think after having rewatched it, it had been honestly a few years, many years actually, since I had seen the remake. I think that the last time I watched the remake before the show, I had caught it on cable, to give you an indication of how long ago that would have been. And then today I watched it via the nice new Steelbook Blu-ray edition that came up for sale a few months ago.
That is how I've watched it most recently too, and I've caught it a few different ways. I've caught it on TV. You know, when I cleaned hotel rooms, it was often I would pause for a minute while making beds and turn a TV on, because there's a couple beds to make. It takes some time to make them hotel proper, and I'll just turn on the TV and watch a little Bates Motel. But sometimes there'd be a movie on, and if it was The Ring, it sure was hard to turn that off, because I really enjoy this movie. It's one of those movies that if it was on TV and I had a TV that had cable television, I'd probably watch it every time it came on. It is quite different from the original, and the conversations that we're having about the main characters do differ slightly just because of cultural differences, the actors cast, and the way that they deliver these performances, even though the stories are beat for beat very, very similar. Have you ever read the manga or the book that came along with this, the original by Koji Suzuki?
Yes, I have read the original novel, and I also have the manga series that was released in Japan and then later released by Dark Horse in the West, that very interestingly combines the things that occur in the book with the movie. So in the manga, it's the most of the characters from the movies, but Sadako or Samara's background is identical to what it is in the book.
Interesting. I have never read the book, which makes me a very bad booktuber. I ought to read the book, but then I've also got a huge copy of Battle Royale that sits on my shelf as sort of decoration, right? I've never read that either because it's huge.
Yes. I also wanted to point out that what you had said, anytime that it was on cable TV, you would watch it. I just want to point out that the last time that I watched it on cable, I did end up watching the movie twice in a row. It was the station, I had caught it maybe midway through, and I had watched it, and then it was very late at night, and I guess after the movie was concluded, it, boom, just started the opening sequence of the same movie again. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to watch it until it gets back to the part previously that I was watching it at. So I've seen the whole movie. And then I ended up, of course, just sitting there and watching the entire movie again. So that gives you an indication about how much I liked it. I wouldn't call you a bad booktuber for not reading the book, though, because I think, and please no one crucify me, I think it is logical and completely understandable to like this story independent from the book. I am a Ring mega fan, all right? I have this movie's soundtrack on vinyl. the Hans Zimmer soundtrack I got from Waxwork. Like I am like, so for me to want to read the story, which is different enough that I think that people might not really like it. All of the stuff that we associate with Samara Morgan or Sadako, with the videotapes and coming out of the TV and all of that stuff is not present in the book. So the most iconic things that we know from it, I think that you could be a fan of the book and fucking hate the movies, or you could like the movies and fucking want nothing to do with the book. That's what I think.
I'll have to read it because I had watched a booktuber most recently, Anda Kent, who does a bit of a really casual comparison of the two movies in the book. And it's interesting because there's some things, of course, not having not read the book, that I didn't know were present in the original idea of Samara, or Sadako, more accurately, with her hermaphroditism. I did not know that that was a portion of her story, and I think that that's crazy interesting. And sure, we might be going into an Angela Sleepaway Camp sort of level of novelty with that inclusion in the story, or I'd have to read it for myself to judge that, right? If it is intrinsic to her as a person, or we're getting into John David Lindquist version of Let Me In. Does Ellie need to have both or no gender? So it's very interesting to me, that angle, just that small angle, let alone the descriptions of the way that her hatred manifests and whether she is a villain or a victim. So all of those sort of angles in the book, I'm very interested to read someday.
Well, it's one of those instances where the book is not hard to track down.
Yeah.
So I got mine on Amazon. So I think that I definitely think that it's worth a read just to see the interesting thing. Now, Kozi Shuzuma said that of the aspects that they incorporated into the films, he quite liked them. He thought they were very interesting and very creative. And in a roundabout way, said, oh, maybe I would have wished that I would have thought of doing something that interesting with the curse, had he thought of it. But I think that when it comes to how this film was introduced to the West, everything that I know about the remake and my interpretation of how the story is parsed to us, a Western audience, man, do they think we're dumb. Man, is it just like, eat your fucking porridge, numbnuts, like, da, 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 da. Like, because the things that I thought were very cool about this remake that I liked when I was young. And remember, I was like 16, 17 when I saw this movie originally. I liked it more because it explained it more. Now, as a 39-year-old man, I think they might explain it a little too much. Not just Samara's origin, which I think is very interesting to have that fleshed out a lot more, to make it explicit that, oh, she's the rascal, that one. But everything from videotapes to why the rental office has VHS tapes in it in the first place, whether or not kids pay for their fucking hotel rooms, like all of this, like I just couldn't help but get bogged down by so much extra information in literally every scene. Everything is not left to your imagination. Nothing is left for interpretation. We are going to fucking tell you why this chair is here and not there, why this book is there and not here, why this person talks to this person and not that person, what school this fucking dude goes to. We're going to know all of this fucking shit.
I don't know what it is in our culture that has made us so bullet point hungry for that sort of stuff either. This isn't even the worst offender when it comes to things like that. In hindsight, maybe it is worse than it seems when you're first watching it. When I was in my early 20s as well. So like, it didn't dawn on me that it was spoon feeding me so much. And compare it to films that do spoon feed people quite badly nowadays, because that's like my number one turn off when it comes to any film when they're constantly showing flashbacks in case you forgot something that happened at the beginning of the movie that you were here watching. Because I guess so many people watch movies with their phone in front of their face, right? And they're not actually watching it. And there's so many of like ending of such and such explained film, like on YouTube, like little videos about how to explain the film. And I see so many posts on Reddit about such and such film, I didn't get it. Now, they're not talking about Memento, which was specifically designed to fuck with your brain, or John dies at the end. I'm talking about like regular films, like Woman in Black. Woman in Black, ending explained. You don't need it. And that film does a good job, just to pick on Woman in Black, of not spoon feeding you and leaving some to your imagination while also spoon feeding you and not leaving lots to your imagination, which I think The Ring does strike a balance there when not compared to the original, which does leave so much to our imagination and leaves so many vagaries and small, tiny mysteries that I don't know. I'm more hungry for, and you apparently are more hungry for. I guess the general population at large is not, though. They're hungry for little point bullet lists and things explained, flashbacks, and being told the same information 3 times so it sticks.
I want to take the listeners' back lids if I can.
Do I get to do the Scooby-Doo music, like sound effect?
I want to take them backwards to the year 2002. And here I am watching this film. I've told this story before. The truncated version is someone convinced me to rent this film, which I remember hearing about in the when they were coming to theaters, but I never really watched it. And one of the things that I was thinking about that I had forgotten, one of the reasons why I didn't want to watch the film, which is funny, looking on it back now. But regardless, I didn't want to watch the film, or I wasn't very interested, but I kept hearing how scary it was. This person convinced me. We watched it. They fucked off. They fucked off before the opening sequence was even fucking done. Those schoolgirls were still alive when they left my house.
Wow.
So, and then I was like, fuck you, I'm going to fucking watch this movie. And I ended up loving it. Like, thinking it was one of the greatest horror movies I'd ever seen at the time. And that was a lot of people's reactions. This film, in much the same way that the original did, kicked off this explosive interest in supernatural horrors in Japan. They wondered, could they get a Western audience to pay attention to this film the way Japanese audiences did, by stripping away a lot of the things that made it an inherently Japanese story, and then they put it through a Western lens. And it did gangbusters. This film made $250 million globally. It was a huge smash success. But more importantly, in the same way that supernatural horror was launched in Japan and Asia in general, in the West, it made a feverish hunger for Japanese and other Asian countries' remakes of supernatural horror films. Ghosts were backlids. We were done with self-referential meta horror. All that 90s cycle of slasher stuff that was coming in towards the tail end of the 90s, that was the big blockbusters of their day. That's gone. Now we're in dimly lit rooms with whispered conversations, and now we care a lot about supernatural horror that is coming out of Asia. Now, credit where credit's due, we can't forget The Sixth Sense, also hugely responsible for that movement as well. More serious horror that essentially is like family dramas, because at its core, this is a family drama. And hilariously, they'll nail that to your fucking forehead too. Our son watched the tape. Dun, dun, dun. But, so I just wanted to put that in context for people, that this movie was huge. This was the fucking horror movie that everybody was talking about in 2002.
And this, dear listeners, is why we're doing it as episode 201, part of our 200th episode extravaganza, because it is too big for our britches. It hardly fits in both our pants sewn together. The Ring is huge, and it's one of those huge movies that we'd avoided. And I loved it too when I first saw it. Loved it. I watched it. Me and my mom watched it. My mom watched it a few times, and we joked about, are we going to be cursed now? Like, like everybody did. We absolutely loved it, and we had seen it as rental, so we were like late stage fans of this film. A lot of people had already seen it. It had already garnered a lot of money, buzz, talk. It was the Die in 7 days thing was already a meme before memes were memes. I see dead people, die in 7 days. Those were the things that you could just say. I don't know, is there a word for a verbal meme, like a little mimesis, a little thing that people say that is a meme, but before memes were memes? I don't even know. But anyway, I had suggested this to anyone who was a film fan or horror fan because it sort of straddles those groups a lot, like Silence of the Lambs did, as far as blockbuster, award worthy horror. Anyone could be recommended
Yes.
Silence of the Lambs. It's a great film, a very great film. And even if you're not a horror fan, you can recommend that. And if someone's not a horror fan necessarily, unless they're very, very easy to scare and don't like thrillers, supernatural, ghost stories, anything like that at all, or even remotely horror adjacent, you could recommend this as a very well done film. And I had recommended it to a literature fan, sometime horror fan, and huge film fan, huge film fan, a friend of mine who watched it, loved it, yet also hated it, and really felt very deeply uncomfortable due to the animal violence, the horse in particular,
The
which,
horse scene,
yeah,
yeah,
it
that's
had
rough for people.
totally gone over my head because I'm not as sensitive to that sort of thing, especially not in fiction. I'm very, very sensitive to it in real life, like anyone ought to be extremely sensitive to that. If anyone were even slapping a dog too hard, let alone what goes down in this film. And it's not like a person necessarily caused this, it's not like a human being violent toward an animal, but it is an animal death scene that is quite brutal and very well filmed, so it's heart-wrenching to watch. And he was basically like, don't ever recommend me films again, ever, because I don't trust you anymore. And I felt rotten, and I still feel rotten because I talk about it to this day.
That horse sequence is definitely something that I would try to remind people or warn people subtly about. It can be a lot for animal lovers, and particularly like people are pretty sensitive around dogs, but I find people are pretty sensitive around horses too, and they're beautiful animals, so it's hard to watch that. But I also find that it hasn't aged great. Like it doesn't really look very real to me. So I at no point did I was like, did they really throw that horse over the boat? No, of course it didn't. It doesn't look real. But at the time, it would have been pretty authentic. I wanted to ask you something, Liz, about this film because I don't. When I first saw this, I wouldn't have had the words for it. But you are smarter than I am, and more articulate, and know more about horror. What was it about this film? Because you liked it, what was it about this film that you felt was different? What was it about this film that struck a chord with people the way that it did? Or let's forget the general population because I know you can't speak for all of them. What about you? What was it about this film that you particularly liked?
Well, I'm not smarter, more articulate, or barely know anything more about horror, but I,
Calm down.
yeah, I really think that it was just a deviation from this sort of paint by numbers filmmaking and horror that we're seeing as far as the commonly recommended films. And the 90s horror cycle is not immune to this, where it was like mom and dad are architects and they work from home and make billions and trillions of dollars, and everyone lives in a goddamn mansion. And we had a certain sort of color palette used, and it was very plain, almost like you want to blame Wes Anderson films for this too, because it's just a very particular look, very particular soundtrack. And the soundtrack in this is very different. The soundtrack is unsettling, and I think there's a lot of scenes with no sound at all. I would have to watch it again for the 7,000th time to correct me if I'm wrong. That, or as you would know,
You're
like the
correct.
soundtrack's so understated that there could be
Yes.
many portions where it's almost like a static sound, but you're not sure. in a way because it is just such a natural sounding soundtrack outside of the swells. But yeah, it's a quiet film, period, and it's not mumblecore whisper, but like you said, there's whispered dialogue that makes you feel like you're very much part of the story instead of watching this fantasy story, which most films in the 90s seem to be like. This is an after school special come to life for grown-ups, and this was everything but that. The color palette, absolutely different. Bluish green is the color that comes to mind. Dark darks, lots of blacks, misty whites. I don't think there's anything that's pure white in this entire film, it seems, except the ring of the ring in the short film that is presented within part of it. That color palette is so muted, and this is where it differs quite drastically from the original too. That's one of the bigger differences I find. Is they're similar in tone, similar in look, but that color palette is something. And you can, to this day, use a color table that mimics the ring or is pulled directly from the ring as far as its color palette and apply it to film and photos, and people will, if not right away, but subconsciously know it's from the ring because of that particular color. It is just so it's so significant with the story too, and it really was a departure from anything else that I can recall at that time, aside from the sound and the color, which you think are like completely subconscious things, but it's the psychology of film. That's everything. That is really everything. You could take any film, slow it down. That's why the joke of A24 films, when you can film things like an A24 film, because it's that color palette, the soundscape, the lighting, and that's the style. That is the entire feel of the film. The script doesn't fucking matter.
Yeah. Or if A24, just put Mia Goth in it again. People are going to love it.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you really nailed it when you were talking about the music. That Hans Zimmer score, I remember finding out that he was the one that did this years later. I was like, really? That's incredible. Somebody who would go on to do like massive fucking movie franchises that make hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. And, you know, his talent shines through in this film as well. But that color palette, this is in a way, even though my ultimate rainy day horror film would probably be the original Ring, this remake is such a great damp, rainy, those blues, like you said, those greens, particularly when they're around the cabin and they have like those lush, mossy greens. It just evokes this time and this place. And what I think was so different to me, and what I'm curious how you responded to it, and obviously to our listeners, like if you haven't seen this film, I mean, it's pretty old. Spoilers, with all due respect. The ending is so fucking bleak. And yes, it is the same ending as in the original. However, this was the first one that I saw. And this idea, when you watch a ghost story and you are watching them go through their microfiche, going through newspapers, talking to witnesses, doing all the things that you're supposed to, and then even this extended melodramatic dialogue about this poor little girl all alone in that well. Why would they have done this to her? And then the twist is that it is an evil little girl that just likes killing. Just fucking likes killing. There's no tragic backstory. The only tragic thing is her parents tried to love her, and she's so hideously evil that she was made impossible to love. And that bleakness, I got me hook, line, and sinker, because coming out at when it did, when a lot of horror was moving towards darker, and this is just a PG-13 horror film / thriller, and they still nail this incredibly downbeat ending and not make it ambiguous, but make it explicit. You were helping a terrible fucking entity who tricked you because you felt sorry for it because it looked like a little girl.
Throughout this film, too, we're introduced to a whole bunch of broken families, which I think better mirrored the actual North American populace that was the target audience of this film, instead of just a happy, dappy mummy and daddy kind of stuff. We're also delivered the news, so to speak, that they've gone about this wrong near the end of the film by a very young boy who is very robotic, who I just adore. And I adore this same kid, like the character of Aiden in the remake. I adored him in the original too. I just love these robotic kids, and they're not the norm. The broken families in film were not the norm, even though they were the norm in reality. So many things are just subversive and sort of gently or subconsciously subversive throughout this film. It's no doubt that it's going to subvert the ghost story entirely with the way that this pans out, as far as Samara just being absolutely evil and not a victim as much. So I totally agree. It turned the ghost story entirely on its head. Absolutely. And so many people had not seen the original film, so they had no idea what they were in for. A lot of people weren't in on Asian horror at this point either, the way that many horror fans could have been at the time, because it was becoming popular within some circles. But by and large, the people who made this movie millions and millions of dollars weren't horror fans necessarily. They were now converts to horror films, and they were not used to Asian horror storytelling whatsoever. So it just really broke a lot of molds. And I think that we were just ready and primed for something new, because it was getting old. There was already joking about floating head covers. There was already joking about trailer farms or trailer houses, and everything was cut the same. Everything looked the same. Everyone fucked the same. Everything talked the same. It was disgusting and boring and not scary. We needed this when it came around.
I completely agree with you. Fuck all that, Liz. What is this movie even about anyways?
I don't know what this movie's even about.
I'll tell you what this movie is about, Lids, if you'll indulge me. I'm going to flip the format a little bit. This movie is what happens when you and your dude bro frat fucker boyfriends try to record a football game onto a mysterious VHS tape. It brings nothing but death and destruction.
Very, very true. And why this wasn't just mistaken as someone's like art film class miscarriage and totally summarily ignored, I'll never understand. But I think it's kind of cool in that Nine Inch Nails music video kind of way.
It does come off as like a Nine Inch Nails video. Maybe it's because didn't Trent Reznor use like pieces of Tetsuo in one of his music videos or something like that? And this comes off as fucking Tetsuo to me.
It really does. I mean, in the book, from what I understand, there are instructions that are at the end of this movie. This, like the Ring film that you find on the VHS tape, that is the embodiment of Samara's hatred and the curse, if you will. Apparently they were taped over in the book, and it's like cutting out the first page of the Death Note, which is kind of messed up to me. But there's no like instructions that come with this tape, so I could see someone accidentally taping over it, especially in that day and age where we were taping over tapes all the time because then things were expensive.
You know what's funny is one of my first thoughts when I first heard about this film was you watch a cursed VHS tape, and even in 2002, that made me pause and say, who has VHS tapes? Aren't we always watching DVDs now? Which was one of the reasons that it's like the concept seemed dated and weird. Now it doesn't seem so dated and weird anymore, particularly because I still fucking have VHS tapes. But when we start this film, it again starts with the same opening sequence as in the original. Super iconic. Two schoolgirls telling each other spooky stories. But there's an extra aspect of this film that I really dialed into upon watching this one. It's this idea that we watch too much TV. That seems to be the thing that they have taken away from the VHS aspect of Samara's curse. you have this opening sequence where these two girls, one of them is telling this nonsensical story about, they say that like we're killing our brain cells by watching. She sounds like fucking Tipper Gore. Like we're killing our brain cells by watching too much fucking TV, and like there's these radio waves going into our heads and shit like that. There's a sequence later in which Rachel is showing fucking Noah her tape, and she's looking into all these apartment buildings, and she's sort of like, they're all watching television. Oh my God. Like, and I'm like, what is the point? What's the message? What are you trying to say? TV is evil? No, you idiots. TV is not evil. Samara is evil. The tape is evil. So, or maybe it's supposed to say, like, if this tape got out, think of the damage it could do, because we all just watch TV endlessly.
I think that is exactly it. And that's the fear when watching something like The Last of Us, where they're like, oh, this infection spreads, something in the food source, probably something simple that's in everything like flour. And that's the scary part, is like, not only because it doesn't really translate this day and age, because we're not watching, by and large, network television on our fucking smartwatches. I mean, I know I'm not. Yeah. And a lot of our more popular streamers aren't network television, and you can start them. They're not like a direct feed, unless you're using Shudder, and it's that as soon as it starts, it's playing Shudder TV, which I kind of dig. I never really watch it, but I kind of dig it. But there's nothing really like that anymore. And at the time, though, there was. You turn on a TV or you walk by a TV store, it's playing some network, usually. Where now it's definitely playing some sort of streamer or store-owned channel, or a YouTube channel or something like that. That is, it seems like the Wild West, but it's really far more controlled as far as what we're being force-fed as a huge culture, huge society. So at the time, if something would have like got out, so to speak, on the airwaves and been like transmitted, especially with something that is as evil and as determined as this videotape, it would have just shown up on every channel across all the airwaves. Although, if that were to happen now, we'd be relatively safe, because, I mean, can you name a household right now where there's a TV on that is tuned to Fox? You know, maybe one.
They have this. They have these conversations about television and screens and stuff like that in a day and age where the internet was still quite young and not a lot of people were using it. I think that as the film series, particularly in the West, as the film series progressed, or even in Japan, they handled this quite well. Talking about the idea of Sadako or Samara making her way to the internet. That is the scary aspect, the true viral nature of her curse, and also how we consume media now and again. You know, I always think about, like, if, let's say, you needed to have a VHS tape, let's say the broadcast to networks, I'd always think about, would it be like kind of like that pirate radio type interruption to people's signals, like when people like took over airways and shit like that, the Max Headroom.
Yeah, that's the one that comes to mind.
Maybe like 2,000, 3,000, let's say even like 10,000 people saw this broadcast. They would be the only ones that saw this broadcast. It's still quite a devastating hit, but it's not like 35 million fucking views on a video that would happen nowadays, or something like that. I think that where this film succeeds, where a modern audience would relate to it more than the original, is what you're talking about, with less so the spoon feeding of the information, but the visuals. Like, they clearly, the movie looks like it cost a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And they, you know, you got like Naomi Watts there, and you've got like other named actors, and it just has this sleekness and high production value that makes you seem like, even now when you're watching it, like this Blu-ray version of it, I would never really know, aside from a few telltale things like the CRT TVs and everyone still having a fucking landline, that this film is even 20 years old. at this point. Um, when we get to meet Rachel's son, her little fucking Edgar Allan Poe puppet that she has as a boy, I feel like, he likes to draw. He's very goth.
He likes to draw circles and black houses and black things. Black is his favorite color.
It is. He likes to draw his cousin dead, and she likes to call his mother by her first name.
I saw this one little boy when I was a camp counselor who was an angel. He looked like a cherub. He was pale and blonde, blue eyed, sweet, tiny. He was maybe 6 when he was in the class. And there was nothing dark about this kid whatsoever, but black was his favorite color. And so many of his pictures looked quasi demonic because he would trance out and draw circles, or like his sons would be many circles and they'd always be like red or something. Like, it was just bizarre. But there was like nothing psychologically wrong with this child and his sister, who was like kind of a mirror image, enjoyed pink and blue, like it was just, he liked the look of that stark contrast. And we were doing popsicle stick art one day, and he built a church because they come from a religious family, and his sister also built a church, and she painted hers yellow and he painted his black, and then he turned the cross upside down. Totally not, he does not know what he's doing. He's just a kid, does not know what he's doing. He wanted it to look like an old church. That was what his motivation was. It's just putting that out there, that not every evil goth kid is evil goth kid. This actor, coincidentally, is now an attorney. He's also still acted here and there, but he's an attorney, which fits so perfectly with the character he's playing here, doesn't it?
It really does. He just kind of reminds me of like a kid that Tim Burton would insist he was exactly like. I was just like this kid. It's obsessed with the macabre and the darkness, and all that kind of shit. And that's what it strikes me as. He's wearing his regulation short pants, and he's just like, tying his own tie, and is very independent. I think that the interesting thing about the way that Naomi Watts plays the character of Rachel is she's a lot harsher. Like she's I think when you're watching like Japanese actors act as these characters, even though they're both reporters, the Japanese actor comes off as a lot more demure and but like professional, obsessive. But like, whereas Naomi Watts is coming into the classroom and she's fucking cursing up a storm, and she's like telling her coworkers to get away from her, like fucking waving them off and shit like that. And she just comes off as a lot more like, oh, I see. This actually is expanded a little bit in the remake sequel that they did a couple years later, where you find the Rachel character trying to adjust to being in a small town where she's used to being in a big city reporter, I suppose. When you get to the funeral sequence, you can see that she's trying to she's on the case. So she's like trying to like, she's like grabbing smokes, and she's trying to like act casual but still pump these kids for information in a way that comes off as like, are you supposed to be undercover? Like, are you supposed to not let them know that you're a reporter and you're trying to figure out, like, you have the perfect reason to ask these fucking questions. That was your niece, wasn't it? So
yeah, she's
so
trying to blend in like,
to...
hello, fellow kids. I am also young and hip. You can share your secrets with me. I'm also not a reporter. Let's just forget that, because I'm sure some of them knew that. But yeah, no, it is a very weird kind of delivery, but it works. It definitely works, especially when you have other things reinforcing this attitude, with the fact that she is just as brash with her son. Her son refers to her by her first name. Her son's relationship with his father, which is mirrored in a scene exactly in the rain when they encounter one another on the side of the street outside of the house where he is on his way to school, and the ex and the father, the ex-husband or father or whoever it was, boyfriend, is coming up to visit Rachel, and they just stop and look at each other sort of like, hello, fellow human, I am your progeny. I acknowledge this. Good day to you, sir. And they just walk soundlessly away from one another. I love that scene, but it just also reinforces her very cold, structured nature as far as the way that her life has to be for her to function, and how that coldness is reinforced by everyone around her. Where in the original film, I found the mother was quite a bit more tender and probably had a lot of regret about the way that her life needed to be structured. Where in this one, I don't think there's an ounce of regret there. This is just what she does.
There really isn't an ounce of regret from her. Now, I don't think that like she is a bad mother, but I think that it makes a lot more sense, at least to me. I know at the time when I watched it, it made a lot more sense why her son was so independent, like a little adult, kind of like the type of son that I think parents who don't really want kids hope their kids would be like.
Damn right.
Just like a quiet kid who knows how to dress themselves and cook for themselves and will in a way kind of be like your little butler, like laying her dress out and shit like that for her, and helping her out that way, as opposed to, you know, what kids are really like, which is disruptive, and, you know, bless their little hearts. But I think that I think that it's interesting when you have this boyfriend come in and their relationship is a little is very identical, but there is one missing aspect from this character that's in the original version that I wanted to get your thoughts on. He ain't psychic in this one. So on the one hand, it makes a lot more sense that Noah is, I don't fucking believe any of this fucking shit that you're saying. Like, this is fucking outrageous and ridiculous. Cursed videotape? Like, what the fuck are you talking about? As opposed to the Japanese one, where he still has that attitude, but he's also ghosts, frolic and brine, goblins be thine. You're out of your mind. I am psychic, though. I have magical powers that I have given to our son.
Yeah.
But I don't believe in ghosts. I put my foot down.
I'm glad that he's not psychic, because it would ruin any bit of credibility that this guy has. And he operates very much for the very static world of analog technology, where what you're saying isn't possible, period. What we need to do is analyze this tape. So we've gotten a little bit ahead of ourselves as to how she has acquired this tape already.
Oh.
But yeah, because there was a death. There was a death that mirrors another point where the original film and this film are mirrored, where there is a death because of the 7-day curse. These teenage girls, one of them had watched this tape, and it was the same sort of thing. Like, one girl is telling her about the cursed tape, and the other girl is like, oh my God, I've seen this tape, basically. And the other girl says, oh, you kidder. No, you never did. And she's like, oh, yeah, I'm totally kidding. And then the phone rings, and it is this curse. Samara is in the house, basically, as well. We have one of her second most prominent manifestations, quite honestly. Even though we don't see it, we can imagine that it is, because not until much later does she really manipulate a television in the presence of other people.
I think that there's interesting things of note for how this film handles certain aspects. One of the most obvious things is when this girl dies. In the original version, they generally show the dead bodies in black and white. It's hard to really see if they've really done any makeup effects to enhance anything. But in this, the bodies look bloated. They look like they've been in water. They're gray, chalky, ashen, however you want to look at it, slightly blue. They're not just sitting there with their eyes open and their mouth open. They are deformed.
Yeah.
It looks like something is genuinely wrong with them.
A little bit of slippage going on, and like you said, that discoloration. Yeah, it's pretty gross.
It's very gross, very cool. I love the effects, and I think that this starts with we need to show the audience that this is going to be more graphic, and I think that also goes farther with the little indications that you have been cursed. Now, they don't do that much in the original film, but there's all these other aspects in the remake where you are seeing flies and you are seeing examples of the curse. You are pulling out medical strips. Samara's curse is manifesting itself around you before it even does. They expand on this further in the sequels, in which there's even like a club of kids that curse themselves in like probably the best thing that ever came out of the sequel. I have my problems with that film. I don't think it's as bad as some people think it is, but I have my but like the best thing that came out of that sequel, I think it is undebatable, is the short that was on the fucking DVD of this gang of kids that basically goad each other into cursing themselves and seeing how long they can go before passing on the curse. It expands the opening sequence of the sequel.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that fucking extremely cool and fascinating. And I think that you need that because this is a film that is death by appointment. And we've talked about that when we talked about the previous film. But for Western audiences, I think that the filmmakers, rightfully or wrongfully, just said we can't just have a drama where nothing happens and then in the last minute of the film you see a ghost. You like Samara needs to show up. I would almost guarantee you that there was a page beat to that for the script adaptation. Like every, let's say 10 pages, we need a fucking ghost thing every single time.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Also to remind us that this is a very serious curse. It's not just a heart attack that could be easily avoided by not watching a videotape if people would be honest with one another and communicate properly and not believe that it's a jokey curse and take it very seriously, because as serious as a heart attack, because those are very serious, although they're not the most cinematic way to die. So they have to amp that up a little bit. I really like the inclusion of things like the hair, the water, the flies specifically. I still really enjoy the scenes with the flies and the flies showing up on the TV screen when things start to come out of the tape and when the tape starts to change, which we see a lot more of that in this compared to the original. So I really enjoy the short film, so to speak, that is within this particular iteration of The Ring. It's so much more scary and atmospheric.
The cursed videotape has a lot of imagery in the Western version that is not present in the Japanese version. I think not only where there might be some things that would culturally be a little bit difficult to parse, obviously things like kanji you can't have, but also Samara's background, while similar, is also quite different. And that goes to going to the ranch, like horses and the view of that Samara Morgan had, and also like her time being analyzed. Now in the original we have the sense that she was analyzed. She had a doctor and she was also basically paraded around like a sideshow. And look at this psychic. Well, her mother was, and then Sadako was like this creepy little girl that was also psychic, but maybe too evil to parade around as much. But this is all Samara, and the idea of this little girl that doesn't sleep. So you have these aspects of the film that are expanding, and the thing that I like about the manifestations that are happening to Rachel over the course of the 7 days is they're all directly related to Samara's upbringing or death. And either like her hair, the water, the medical examination stuff, all of that things paints a tapestry of her origin story. And I think that is brilliantly woven into the film. Some of the ham-hock dialogue where I feel like they just need to have like a conversation. When Rachel goes up to the cabin where her niece and all of her friends stayed, there's a baffling sequence that I was watching from a new perspective. I didn't hate it. I don't want anyone to think that I hate this movie. I really like it. However, when you're talking to the manager, there's so much extra information that is happening here, including a magic show that is not present in the original. And I can't help but wonder, why? Why do you need flavor text with this guy? Is it so he seems more real? Is it more sad when he also dies? like, what are we trying to just establish more character? Are we padding for time? What is going on here, do you think?
It could be who they've cast. I'm not that familiar with Richard Lineback, but he is a more famous actor, not to the level of Naomi Watts, but um, he's an older actor as well. So he had a lot more
Hmm.
legacy. He's a stage and theater actor as well. So maybe that helped flavor that particular character. But you're right. We don't we don't need it. It doesn't matter whether he dies. Really, we could have not seen that actually, and it wouldn't have changed the story at all. I don't think. So yeah, it is just distracting, and it is just padding when they don't really need it. They could have used it elsewhere, definitely, or even just more quiet, tense scenes. Really, not that it was lacking those, but they didn't really need to make this take so long because she literally could have walked in there and asked for the key and then cut to being in the cabin.
It's funny because I find that they seemed to want that sequence to take the same amount of time as in the original film, where the woman goes up, she goes and she watches the tape. But if you notice that scene where Naomi Watts is by herself in the cabin and then waits and then turns on the videotape, all of that is so much shorter than it is in the original version. And that same amount of time is used to like talk to this person who's more of a character. So I'm wondering if they just felt like, well, we can't just have Naomi Watts just in a room by herself acting with no dialogue, which is sad because that's my favorite fucking sequence in the original film. I love watching as she like sits down on the couch and sort of looks through some books, and like you're settling in and it's quiet and it's eerie, it's creepy because you're in this room and you know that something happened here where a bunch of characters died and shit like that, or would eventually die. And so she's trying to figure it out. And then eventually she watches the tape. They just don't pull the taffy enough on it. And I think that in lieu of that, we have just too much explanation about, like, they wanted to watch a football game or they were complaining about the TV. They didn't pay. So yeah, the reception up here isn't really good. That's why I have all these tapes for people to rent. Oh, you got quite a selection. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff that's left by people as hand-me-downs. Ha ha ha. I was like, none of this matters. None of this fucking matters.
No, she could have and kind of should have just walked into the cabin and found the tape.
Yeah, like, but I think again it goes to what I was saying, where like they just don't have enough faith in their audience to sit patiently while an actor acts in a room by themselves, like, which is not the right call in my opinion, but I can understand it.
Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of the scene where we're sitting in the hotel room or the cabin in the original one and nothing's really happening. It's interesting and it's kind of pretty, and it's nice that she gets a moment to herself and quiet, when also in the back of my mind during that scene is like, you could be at home taking care of your kid, but whatever. Yeah,
Yeah,
like she's wasting
I'll give you
time
that.
in a way. But yes, it is way too fast paced in the remake. So somewhere in the middle would have been the best balance there between both films, really honestly.
Hmm.
But it is just a waste because everyone, if they're so hungry for bullet notes because they need to be fed information to make sense of a film, this is not contributing to it.
Um, when she eventually realizes something is definitely up with this tape, she seems haunted by looking at. Look, it's a fucking weird tape. The millipede or centipede, which one is it? Do you know?
That would be
Uh,
a millipede, I believe.
yeah, the millipede alone is creepy enough where I'd be like, ooh, I fucking don't like that thing. But uh, would be enough to creep me out. But there's a lot of like weird imagery of like cables going down people's throats, and the chair and the ladder and the horse eye. I wouldn't even know enough that was a horse's eye, but it is.
And the apparent
Um,
suicide. I mean, we can't leave that out.
oh yeah, sorry, I totally forgot. Um, but I think that there's something to be said for the more startling imagery that is on that videotape, and Rachel seems pretty haunted by it. when she eventually shows her ex's stuff, like she's coming to him as like this hardcore video geek. She calls him as much when he tries to explain to her why the origin of the tape is impossible. And I really like these explanations. I know I kind of kid it hard for over explaining it because you don't really need to know the nitty gritty. But for someone who loves the story as much as I do actually really like the ominous information of like, there's no data on how this was recorded. This tape simply just is. It comes off as more otherworldly. It comes off as more impossible. And as we progress in the film, there's more augments of reality that will also seem impossible. But the tape's very nature of this unknowable thing, I find very cool.
It mirrors that almost Curlian photography that they're getting from her, Samara's sort of mind impressions on the silver nitrate paper, where those are photographs, so to speak, with no negatives. Very similar, and it mirrors that without, at least they don't totally spoon feed us that idea. But yeah, it is weird. It's like a digital photo with no EXIF data for the geeks out there.
Yeah. I really think that when I first watched this film, I remember when I watched the Japanese film later, I had thought to myself, oh, I'm really happy that they explained things so much in the remake because I would be lost on how any of this was happening in the first one. So when I was younger, I really did appreciate how they were spoon feeding us this information. I just feel now as I've gotten older, I just don't need it as much. But maybe I'm just too familiar with the story. Like I know all of these things, so I think it's silly that they're explaining it as much. But there was a time when I didn't know all this, so
Also,
maybe I'm being unfair.
I like learning things from horror, and that's a lot of what I used to enjoy about horror books and still do enjoy. Horror fiction sometimes can teach you something, especially if it's written from the perspective of someone who has a vocation that you're not familiar with and they get into a bit of detail. Now, I was talking with Chris recently about a short story collection that has a lot of jargon and it's ex-military sort of stuff. So they're talking about like guns and ammo and stuff, or different military operations and using a lot of jargon. Not enjoyable. That's like we definitely agreed that that can get old after a time. But when you're learning about like a dentist or something that is a like dentistry isn't really usually explored in horror film, like that would be kind of fascinating. It's usually architects for whatever reason, and it's like they don't even explain what an architect actually does because it's just boring to most people, I guess. So that's unfortunate. But they don't talk about like what kind of pencils they favor or what sort of sharpeners and erasers they favor or what an electric eraser costs. You know, those sorts of little things that might be genuinely interesting and teach you something about that vocation. I really do like that sort of stuff, especially when it comes to AV or photography. So this guy is high up in my books as one of the more interesting horror movie dads, I guess, because he is a horror movie dad, no matter how you slice it. So I find him interesting and far more interesting than a psychic guy who is doing the exact same role. I found that was clutter. So they've sort of taken some clutter out and added some clutter in. They've added clutter when she goes to the hotel. They've taken clutter out of the father's character, Noah. And they've also taken some clutter out to a certain extent with the volcano being replaced with a horse farm in a way.
Yeah.
Because that whole story and having to go elsewhere to visit someone not really in on the story that was sort of like a tertiary subject of the volcano story sort of helps keep the story a little straighter because the whole community knew about this horse farm and was part of the story of the horses. And the horses feature quite largely in the video and quite largely when she takes the ferry to go and visit. But yeah, she has this video and it is starting to progress. Do we get title cards much like The Shining or Hell House or The Grudge or anything like that where we're saying the day countdown? Do we get a day countdown or is she just mentally telling us what day we're on?
We get a day countdown from Thursday to Thursday. We get we get every time it's a different day. It starts with like dun dun with like it's not like a
Law and Order.
clean title. No, it's not like a clean title card with a black background. It's overlaid over top of the opening sequence, so they have an establishing shot of where they are. And literally from the next day after she watches the tape, it's like Thursday and then Friday and Saturday, et cetera, et cetera.
A little subtle and does still reinforce death by appointment. We're getting that sort of tension build up just from the progression of days and the progression of symptoms, which we didn't get as much in the original. The symptoms, like you've said, are so much more pronounced and so much more Samara driven.
The interesting thing about the analysis of the tape, going back to that AV stuff that you're talking about, is they're constantly deconstructing this tape beyond what they did in the original film. And I mean, like, they're increasing like the aspect ratio to try to find images that we couldn't possibly see. We were like enhancing and zooming, and we're printing out different sequences. We're doing all of this fucking shit, like going, it's like a forensics team going through this tape. And I really, really like all those aspects, particularly since part of the sleuthing of what's on this tape is like more so than, oh, there's a lighthouse in the background. And then you have to find that beyond the aspect ratio. Oh my God, there's a lighthouse. Can I print that out? Is there a big book of lighthouses somewhere that I can that I can grab that will have photos, and then I can find the island that I need to go to, and I can go and I can talk to these people that have this town tragedy that, you know, it's like a bunch of weary wool sweater wearing like people that are like hugging themselves to the chilly breeze and telling the story of years gone past. I'm like, oh my God, I'm eating this up. I am fucking eating all this fucking shit.
Makes you want to go to like Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket Sound in the middle of winter. So you just get that cozy wool sweater feeling. I've actually, not too long ago, purchased a book on mid-century buttons because there was a murder case where there's a button found underneath the person, and it's sort of almost like a canvas button too, though, so it complicates the thing, but the design on the button is quite unique. And so I found myself, like countless others, no doubt, poring over these button books that would give you, like, it's almost like a stamp collector's book that tells you the origin of the stamps and the designer and the circulation and all that stuff. Or coin collecting books. Numismatics is something we're more used to seeing, a book on those things, or books on antiques or dolls and stuff like that. But there are, of course, like, as we've seen, books on lighthouses. There's even a book on outhouses of North America.
Is there really?
There really is. Coffee table books know no bounds, Wes. If you can take photos of it and commit it to print, there is a book on it, no doubt.
There's nothing, this is like, has nothing to do with anything, but there's nothing cozier to me than those big books of like Ontario birds. I love, like, if you got like a fucking book and you know the ones that they're like this fucking big, and you just open them and they have like a lot of like tasteful artistic drawings of like, here's a robin, here's like a Phoebe, here's something like that. And like that's like the ultimate like coziness. And I can imagine like if you went to like a grandparent's house and they would have like a big old book of lighthouses or buttons or something that you would not even think of, like someone made a book about this and it's just full of like black and white photos. It would feel so cozy.
If there was anyone out there that doubted that the existence of this lighthouse book, have not been in the lighthouse book section of the local library, I bet. So one thing about these scenes that it only gently drives me crazy. I'm already pretty crazy, so it takes a bit, right? So this is just like a gentle nudge over the edge of craziness. Does it seem to you that she's experiencing physical pain while trying to adjust the tracking knob?
Yes.
Is she receiving electric shocks from the damn thing or something? Like, I've never really understood why she's so tense, and she's like, okay, I just gotta move it just a little bit more. God damn it. And she's trying to print it, and she's so enraged and intense. It's like the most tense scene in the film.
I think that this kind of goes back to when she's with her ex and they're like trying to adjust the tracking wheel and they act like it snaps and like fucking like cuts their hands or something. I'm like, are they injured? And they're like looking at each other like shocked. And I'm like, I think that Naomi Watts is an actor. And she was forced to say, you are going to look at a screen and stuff is happening. So could you just, and she's like, well, what do I do? And she's like, just like, it's like an intense sequence. And she's like, well, I mean, she doesn't even have any glasses to like fucking like hurriedly pull off her face or something like that. So I think she was just like, she made a choice. Like, what if like this is just so intense that it's like, or perhaps like Samara's curse is painful, and by figuring it out and getting closer to the truth, perhaps it's like affecting her internally. But I honestly think the most logical answer for how she acts in that sequence is she went to the director and she's like, look, I don't really have a lot of business here in this scene. Can I just do something in this scene? And she went for it and they liked it because it's weird.
You don't have the Wahlberg angle of let me just shave my face every time I need something to do with my hands. So she acts like she's trying to get a zipper up and it breaks a nail every time her hand slips or something like that. It's bizarre to me. It will always strike me as bizarre because I've definitely worked on a lot of video and photography in my time, and analog photography and video, and I've never experienced that sort of tension and physical pain when trying to capture a screenshot personally.
Well, it's kind of like how you've described to me like microfiche scenes, and you're like, why are they always got their glasses on? Why are they always chewing on pencils? Why are they always like, and you were just like, well, because Wes, then they're just looking at microfiche, which takes hours, and it's not very interesting. It's not cinematic to look at microfiche.
It's not, but they've definitely gone over the edge with this one. This is our microfiche scene, like, of course, no word of a lie. So yeah. But they've gone over that edge, way over that edge. Yeah, it's like watching somebody suddenly rapidly consume an entire pencil. That's what it feels like.
The wood, it's carving at my insides. I think that there was also like an aspect where like maybe like, again, going back to what I was saying, where it's like maybe she's just experiencing the pain that Samara went through during her ordeal when she got dunked in the well. But like, I don't know. I really don't. This whole when she's learning the background of these characters and you encounter Samara's father and stuff like that, this sequence is definitely very different from what they encountered in the original film, up to and including talking about like her mother trying to like drill the images out of her head and stuff like that. It's, again, it takes like this darker, more gory, even though it's still, they don't show you these things, but they're just talking about these very gory, dark things.
Mm-hmm. I really enjoy this because it still does work as far as that visual that you may or may not have, whether it's on the tape or not, of someone throwing themselves in a volcano or throwing themselves off the edge of a cliff, because that is the ultimate end to Anna Morgan, the horse breeder. And you could say, from the point of view of the townsfolk, she would just be somebody distraught. From the point of view of the characters in this film later on, it's like all that she could do. From the point of view of her husband, you know, if only she'd taken him with her, sort of thing. And it's just, you know, quite tragic, but it has that same sort of feeling of somebody throwing themselves into a volcano, which is basically what Anna Morgan had done by adopting a young girl. So this scene of her going over is a break in the opposite way, where later on in the original film, when they're down in the well and there's buckets of water happening and they're freaking out and it's all tense and dark and it's a total departure, I find that her going over toward the lighthouse and her spending her time on this island that used to be populated by horses until they all committed suicide, which is just crazy. it's that same sort of break in the opposite direction. It takes an already fairly quiet movie and makes it even more quiet, claustrophobic, shrouded in fog. You meet some more characters though, and as far as fluff, I really do appreciate the doctor on the island. What do you
Yes.
think?
I am right there with you. I know that I was kidding the movie pretty hard for all of its fluffy extra dialogue and extra characters. The babysitter,
Yeah,
like holy shit,
like who cares?
like why do we need this sequence? But this character has extremely valuable information for us, for starters, because you need to see where this film was fleshing out how it was going to be different from the original film. Now, if you don't have a psychic dad to grab someone's arm and give you a flashback sequence that we can all watch
Yeah.
so we can get a little bit of information, you need a character to tell this story. And I don't remember the actor that they got to play this doctor, but she's fucking great in this role.
Just looking it up really quick, it's Jane Alexander.
Jane Alexander. Wow, it's a fantastic performance. Really gripping. It has my attention. I believe her as a character. You can see the it's a perfect balance of reluctance, but yet I'm going to give you information because you need to know this stuff. Not as squirrely as the father is, for example, and all that kind of stuff. It's like that feeling, maybe as a reporter, maybe you can speak to this as a journalist, but when you finally have found the person who has the information that you fucking need and is willing to talk to you about it.
And I really like her attitude toward it all. Very non-judgmental. These are just sort of the facts, which sort of speaks to her profession as a doctor. It's probably her default bedside manner, but she also has struggles as a parent herself with a child who's afflicted with something. And you can't, you know that she's not passing judgment on the Morgans at all, but maybe would have been one of the only people that considered them or had her considered as a friend in any way, shape, or form, because everyone else on the island would have shunned them entirely. Not with good reason, really, but with that misunderstanding of what they were going through, where the doctor would have had that inside track. I really love her performance too, and that is the embodiment of hot cup of coffee, cozy wool sweater,
Yes.
edge of the
Yes,
sound,
yes,
kind
yes.
of salt stained everything kind of life. I like her very much.
And the amount of times they cut to like this deep churning ocean water during these sequences is so effective. It almost has like an ASMR quality to it, where you're just listening to the ocean, and like the movie is just so oddly soothing at times on top of the score. When we get to Samara's little, what is it? What would you call it? It's not a shed. It's a barn, right?
Where she'd been kept, yeah, it's a barn and a hayloft, but it's just it's so I've never seen a hayloft quite like that. That's for sure. But it would have been built, I suppose, by her father in the top of the barn in lieu of a hayloft to have this weird, precarious, nightmarish little room built for her in a barn.
It definitely comes off as like, now I know that you're an evil little girl, so let's give you the creepiest living space that we can muster. I find that the constant images of the tree are really beautiful. I could honestly stare at these sequences forever, and those moments kind of coupled with Samara's song, which is reminds me a lot of the song from The Innocents, the fucking something Willows, Way of the Willows, or whatever that song from The Innocents is.
Yeah.
It's very similar, sort of like childlike rhyme
Yeah.
that she says. I think this is this movie's attempt to replace like Frolic and Brian Goblins Be Thine. They basically give Samara like a whole last song that she can sing. And then the image of this tree burned into the wall. It's very, very cool. And again, this is the type of background stuff that I remember eating up when I first saw this film all those years ago. And I still think it's still effective now.
It really is, and it sort of burnt itself into our collective psyche as well, because whether you've seen this movie once 10 years ago or once every 10 days or whatever. Like, these sorts of images are embodied in the story, aside from the long, black-haired, staring, angry little girl that is common to both films. But of course, this one has so much more iconic imagery, maybe just because of the way that it's filmed. Now, this is directed by Gore Verbinski, of all people.
Yeah.
Which,
yeah,
as far as I know, went on to do nothing like this ever again.
yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
I think this was just one of those instances where they were going to do like a big budgeted boutique horror drama that was becoming more and more prevalent and would explode after this film's success. But they still do these types of things where you get prestige actors to do these horror dramas. I mean, for God's sakes, everything from Mama to Hereditary to the Messenger. They bring in these like actors and directors and people who typically don't do horror, and they get them all together and do a very serious horror movie that functions primarily as a drama. And I think that's how they get people in, because you can always hear them in their interviews like, at its core, this story is really about a family. And that's how they always get into it, right?
So painful.
It is painful because this type of thing, because this was very mainstream. This was listeners, every year it seems there's a couple of horror movies that it seems everybody is talking about. They usually come out around the same time, and by the end of the year it ends up on everyone's top fucking 10 lists and shit like that. And it's not like the weird left field shit that super niche horror people really like. It's kind of stuff that everyone agrees are the best. And whether or not you agree with that is one thing or another. It's not really relevant. But the point is this was that at the time. And so having people working on this film that did makes absolute sense to me. I don't think that they ever thought, I thought that they were going to, they hoped to make their money back. Otherwise, why would you do it?
Of course.
But I think that I think that they were even probably surprised by how you do it. And again, like when you go back and I was thinking about years later, I was like, fucking Hans Zimmer did the music for this? Like, that's crazy. That's like a fucking legit like film score that does film scores for movies that cost like $300 million. So, like that is extremely, I mean, it was earlier in his career.
Yeah.
But like, it's still extremely surprising to me when you think about it all these years later.
They must have had some money, though, because they've definitely got Naomi Watts. They've also got Brian Cox, which I always confuse with Stacy Keach. I hope I'm not alone in confusing those two men all of the time, being convinced that Brian Cox was in the undersung American sitcom Titus, whatever. But yeah, I'm sure he didn't come cheap either. Brian Cox was a name actor and was a very, very prolific actor.
Yes. Because he was in the Autopsy of Jane Doe, right? That we did.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And he was in a lot of TV at the time.
So, yeah, like I think all of these things together just make this like a classy bit of filmmaking that everyone is just bringing their A game, because I think their default is A game. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, like,
yeah.
I think
why they knock it out of the park with this. And they must have just been living and breathing this lookbook, because they don't falter and they do take it very, very seriously when creating a horror / drama like this. There's not one moment where I feel like they're living this meta where they're an actor in a horror film at all.
I think one thing that's understated about this entire film and The Ring in general is maybe it was the classy bit of filmmaking that it was that skewed the perception, but we were seeing for the first time in a long time a new monster being added to the pantheon of well-known horror monsters, to the point now which, like, when you watch some of the sequels and they're a little, they're not, I like a lot of the sequels, the remake sequels to The Ring, but I'll just say this, they never really achieved what they achieved with the first one ever again. But I think that when you're looking at what happened to Samara in the sequels over the years, she became like a full-on horror movie monster. It was kind of like when you like the same direction all those Alien and Predator movies went, where you watch like some of the later Alien and Predator movies, and you're like, oh my god, yeah, it's just a big dumb monster movie, and you're like, oh, I guess they always were just dumb monster movies,
Yeah.
but they were made so well, and you were of such an age that they just came off as perhaps more elevated than they were. But Samara is right there with like Freddy and Jason. When you see like those horror art tapestries and all that kind of stuff, they fucking they include her. I don't know if it's like kind of like one of those things where they don't have a lot of like female characters that occupy this space as like a horror movie monster that occurs again and again and again throughout sequels. But I think that like it just goes to show that something was happening here with this film and how it would impact people culturally, and in a way that I don't think a lot of people were expecting. I really don't. I really think that the success of this film was something that they all hoped for, but I don't think anyone thought that they were going to get. That was always just my interpretation of it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it was another angle where this film subverts expectations entirely, because you do have Samara, this little tiny girl in a white nightgown and black stringy hair and nothing really doing, up against Freddy and Jason and Michael, who have all got their shticks. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
They're all goddamn court jesters of horror, really honestly. And you have this understated little tiny pipsqueak of a girl who is probably the most terrifying and evil out of all of them, maybe tied with Michael as far as pure evil, and believability.
Yeah.
To a certain degree, Michael's the only one that's really, really honestly believable. But
I believe in that old man strength, let me tell you that.
yeah. Like, I don't know. I think that it is just a lack of incredibly scary and terrifying female horror movie icons, because she doesn't really fit in, except for that she is a scary ghost. But yeah, her father's scene in this is kind of heartbreaking, and it's also, for some reason, it reminds me of the electrical guy in The Running Man with
Oh my god.
yeah, it's sort of like his death. It's like so intense and so much like with the sparks, and he's got this soliloquy he's saying while he's committing his final act, and it's just, he doesn't hit a high note like the electrical guy from Running Man, whose name eludes me entirely, but it's just such a bombastic scene, or maybe like another bombastic death of a more, I don't know, theatrical person is maybe a death in like Rocky Horror Picture Show. I don't know. Like, it's just an intense scene to me, and it is just so, it belongs on stage.
I think it's because this movie is so quiet most of the time. Mm-hmm. The times in which you see a moment that is like for example, when Rachel sees her son watch the tape, right? They cut to her, no, like it's the loudest no, and she covers her boy's face, and it's like, he's already watched it. Like it's so dramatic and intense, and the score is swelling. Same within this scene. This scene seems really disjointed, because she kind of like, I'm gonna come back and like get some more information out of this guy, but instead oh shit, he's actually like in the process of killing himself during this like heinous, chaotic moment in the film. And I always interpret it the same thing with like the guy at the cabin. It's like, we need a body count. We need more bodies, and I bet you that was a note, because if you look at the original, like, people die off camera. You know, like all those students that went to that place, they all died, but the only death that you really see is that one girl, and then you don't have anything else happen really, in terms of like what would make it a scary horror movie until the end, unless I'm leaving out a death in my mind, but I don't think that I am. I think like the original Ring film only has like 2 on-screen deaths in it.
And we have like the aftermath when they open the car door and one body falls out. Like, it's not very
that's
scary.
True, yeah. But this, like, they just keep needing to have more bodies, and they're like, can we do something where, like, we're getting towards the end of the film, can we ramp this up? Can there be like a dramatic suicide or something to sort of remind people that this is a horror movie? Because the whole scene seems tacked on. Like, Rachel goes back to his place basically to like witness him kill himself, and then she is rushed back because, you know, we're barreling towards the climax of this film, and she needs to get back to where she came. A plot point that I love in any version of this film. I love that it all starts and stops at this fucking place. When they get to the end sequence where we're dealing with this well underneath the ground, there is so much more action going on in this with like the TV. It's like the TV's attacking you, maybe, and it's like fucking hanging by a fucking cord. Oh my god, it's so outrageous. But I remember at the time, like, I liked that more than the ending in the Japanese version. Well, the ending in the Japanese version when I was younger, I was like, well, this is very sleepy. This is kind of boring, actually.
And it is what they were up against. You know, they were up against more bombastic, brightly lit, flashbang sort of stuff. We're edging into some very intense action movies to come around the corner. So that's one direction that film was going, and this was kind of trying to take us in another direction while still being up against some more flashy sort of films, like let's say Final Destination films, where there is definitely a note of every 5-page beat of somebody dying and flashy gore all over the screen and loud noises, and smash cut to more loud noises. So that is what they're up against. So I can see that this scene being a little more intense, and it has to kind of mirror, I suppose, the intensity of the original, which also makes no sense in a way because they're feverishly trying to drain this well when they could just reach down and feel around. You know, there's that as an option.
This bucket thing, I don't know, man. Like,
but we have a rescue that is required here. We're not like knee deep in water that we can hop in and out of this well. Like, this is a bona fide deep, scary well that someone who falls into it needs rescue from. And that's what we're faced with. And the not really having other people to draw on, because this is before the world of cell phones in everyone's pocket, you know, so they are sort of isolated. And that's the point of these cabins, is that they are isolated, and the network is spotty even up there, so television doesn't work so much, let alone landlines, emergency services, cell phones. All those things are of no help at all. So you've really got to rely on the slapstick comedy to come with the fire hose.
Fuck, that's fucking funny.
I thought, you know, it's the only sort of Three Stooges moment, and it doesn't even mean to be, I don't think. Or do you think they did? Did Sam Raimi swoop down from on high and say, you know what you guys got to do? A pratfall.
I honestly think that it just kind of came down to, like, this just needs to be an intense action sequence. It all needs to be, we've been patient enough. Now we need some big kick-ass moments that's going to lead you to think that this is the climax of the film, even though, you know, as a modern audience, and let me tell you this, I didn't see the ending of this film coming at all. I did not figure this out. I had never seen a movie like this before. And also, I'm not the type of person that really likes to figure out twists. Mm-hmm. I do really like to let the movie tell me the story that it wants to tell me at the pace. And if you're wondering what's going on inside my brain, I really am paying attention to the scene in the moment and what I'm getting from this. Sometimes if a movie is very, very obviously telegraphed, I'll figure it out. But most of the time, I'm not thinking ahead. I know I'm not common in that sense. I know lots of people love to figure out things in advance, my partner being one of them.
My mother used to as well. It's almost become a cultural trope in a way to beat the movie, and it's kind of disturbing to a certain degree, but hey,
yes,
that's where we're at.
I just find that I enjoy movies more when I don't figure things out, but I didn't see this ending coming at all. And I wanted to talk to you very specifically about Samara's look if you would indulge me.
Yes.
Because for listeners, they pull Samara's body out of the well. It's actually a cool sequence in which you see Samara whole, cherubic, pristine, and then you see the CGI sort of melt away her body, and she turns into a skeleton and her jaw slowly slacks, and then we get the information that, you know, it's past the time in which Rachel had seen the video, so we are to believe that it is fixed. We fixed the problem, whereas we know from being fans of this film and seeing it before, we have not fixed the problem. At the time, I didn't know that. Samara looks very different than Sadako, and I wondered if you could speak to why that might be, because I never understood why she needed to be more grotesque, but also even more supernatural. It's a cool effect that I love, that it seems that she is more like a tape herself. She comes off as like a projected image in a weird way. But why do you think the audience is that just to like zhuzh it up a little bit, or what?
I think so. Or maybe they're trying to go with this sort of realistic look of what a body would look like had it been in a well, especially if it's cold water. So it wouldn't be like a bleach bone skeleton by any means. So it would be a pretty grotesque sight, and it maybe wouldn't have succumbed to as much slippage being in such frigid water, and it would deteriorate to a certain degree on contact with air, or being like disturbed. Or is it a fully like mental thing that Rachel is seeing, that she just did pick up a slimy encrusted bone structure that used to be a little girl and what she had saw was a completely mental image, and what we're left with is what in reality is what she'd picked up from the bottom of the well? Or is it that she is much like a videotape that is, or more like a negative that hasn't been shown to the light in the dark room yet, and you show it to bright sunlight and it just deteriorates like that? Is that what we're getting? I'm not really sure, but I do find it mirrors the state of the people that we see dead from this curse. It explains the water and the bloating and the slippage and the face, all of that very well. It mirrors that and fits with it so much better. And it also fits with, like, people are more up on the forensics of it all, and CSI is a big help at this point, which was also like a very popular show at the time. People really were getting more in tune with what bodies look like, so maybe that was just a little more realistic.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. We get our moment of like Coco and blankets, not sitting on the back of the ambulance, but almost. And well, all is well, because that poor wee thing has been set free. This starts inarguably, there's no argument from me, the best sequence in this film. And the thing that stuck with me the longest, the thing that like, oh my God, she is such a fucking badass. And I remember thinking at the time, I don't know how you felt, but it reminded me so much of anime when I was that age, because of how they project Samara in all of her glory as she finally emerges from the TV. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that, she can move like a tape skipping, and she distorts as if she is on video herself. And we know that what we're looking at throughout the backstory of this film is, they say without saying, she has projected her psychic nature onto a blank VHS tape. That's how this started. In the same way that she was able to project her thoughts, like you were saying, onto those photos. And when Rachel tells her son that, don't worry, it's all going to be okay, we set her free, why did you do that? And then you get the reveal of, or the realization Because, by the way, listeners, we didn't mention this before, but even though there's no psychic dad, we still got a psychic boy. But the psychic boy comes from his link to Samara. That's explored farther in the sequel. But in this case, it's enough to know that with his cousin, she was telling him things beforehand, and then he would get these images in his head because he was connected to Samara, because he was connected to his cousin, and then he watched the tape, and then for some reason he is psychically linked to this little dead girl. But he understands her nature more so than anyone else seems to. And that's when, Rachel's ex, Noah, is going to die. And I remember the first time I saw her like sort of skip ahead, and that essentially like her jump scare that she does to Noah causes him to like fall backwards, and this whole sequence is incredibly more bombastic and intense than it is in the original. In the original, it's creepy and eerie, but it's also quite subtle and quiet. And that actress was like moves in a weird way and filmed in reverse, and it gives it this uncanny valley. Whereas they are throwing special effects at Samara, like full makeup, CGI, all this extra lighting effects are going towards her on top of like this very evil score.
It works so well too. It really does. And I know that you have a specific tenderness when it comes to people that move in that herky-jerky kind of way. So yes, I like that this is sort of a blending of that and just almost an in-camera effect that anyone can sort of pull off in a way, aside from the CG overlay. I mean, it's so effective in that she's so much bigger than a little ghost girl, and she's so much bigger than a curse infecting the airwaves. She's a marriage of those two things, which is so terrifying. Do you think Aiden relates to her the way that he does because they're both young kids that were forced to spend a lot of time alone watching television?
Yes, I think that that's extremely well observed on your part. I've never really thought of it like that before, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that kinship is the where it all starts. And they, again, talking about the sequel, not to like get too focused on that, maybe we'll cover it one day. Mm-hmm. The idea in the sequel is that Samara wants to replace him, wants to be Rachel's child, because she saw how furiously Rachel eventually protects their son.
Yeah.
And the lengths that she'll go in order to do that. And then, you find this idea that like maybe all Samara really wanted was to be loved in that way, and originally saw Aiden as a kindred spirit and like, oh, another child of neglect. Hi, I'm like you. My parents abandoned me too, and they're not paying any attention to me, and I was forced to live on my own. But then in her moments when she is quote unquote defeated, she sees that, oh wait, no, like my parents killed me and his parents protected him. I want to be protected too, and so I'm going to replace this person. That's basically what the sequel's about. So I think that like that is I think you're absolutely right. Cool.
Mm-hmm. Just that kinship entirely, and sees like a little boy version of her and the her that she could have been, like. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he is kind of a closed off, not an evil kid by any means, but he is like an antisocial little grown up, and she struck us as being much the same, and definitely within her mother's shadow.
I think that like Samara almost like struggling with her own evil nature. It's like, well, I just want to be like a normal little girl, and I want parents that love me, but also I have this like fucking monkey on my back that is the fact that I am evil. I'm just like an evil little girl, and I can't fight my inherent nature. So how can I find people that are going to love me but also let me be that evil and not be afraid of me, and let me do what I want when I want, and treat me like a normal little girl. Because the funniest thing is like in the sequel, when Aiden is possessed by Samara, all he fucking does is watch TV. Like he's literally just watching cartoons constantly throughout that movie.
I guess that's all she had to do in her creepy little barn treehouse kind of prison basically, which is what it was. Not unlike a high-rise apartment. So yeah, the one difference, much the same in any iteration of the ring, it seems to be, is that you are saved from the curse by spreading it to others. And I really like the way that it's handled here. And I love the scene. The one scene I feel is missing from the original is the mother deliberately making the child create a copy. And I love that, like holding his little finger and pushing the little button. I don't know what it is about that. It's just so simple, and it is just so like the way you teach a child to ride a bike, I suppose, or the way you teach a child to hold a fork. And it's just so tender and touching, and it means so much. And it's that one little tiny thing that I feel is missing so much from the original.
Yeah, I also agree. I think that that sequence is really cute in a way, and also like just really nails home like the process. So there's no confusion.
Yeah, you don't have to spoon feed that and give you bullet points or flash back to it or have somebody pop in and give you some exposition, do you?
No, you really don't. But yeah, I think that if anyone hasn't watched this film in a while, you should definitely go back and check it out. And I just love even like the last moment when it cuts to like VHS static, as if this whole thing you've been watching is the cursed tape. I can tell you it was effective, very, very effective. It's creepy the first time I watched it, and I was like, oh yeah, that was a nice touch. I like that.
I really enjoyed that too. That's something that my mother enjoyed so much because she was also the girl that was somewhat convinced maybe that Blair Witch was probably real.
Listen, we were all there to some degree. What do we got next for him?
Coming up next, like another round of deja vu, we have The Grudge, and it is the remake of The Grudge. So very interested in talking about that, even though we've already covered Ju-on. This is part of our 200th episode extravaganza that spreads over 4 different episodes where we talk about some of the biggest horror films that have roots in Asian horror. The Grudge is one of the scariest films. Like, this was a film that somebody had told me, a grown man, that he could hardly remain in the theater. He was so scared.
Yeah, another grown man, will tell you the same thing. I've never been more scared in a movie theater than when I saw this. And only the other horror film that ever scared me in a movie theater was The Blair Witch. So it's in good company. And I'm excited to finally talk about it so we can like really get into this film, because I want to talk about the unique aspect of a English audience versus a Japanese audience. We have the instant in which the same writer-director can now reinterpret his own work for a Western audience. And the result is deeply fascinating.
Awesome.
I'm Les Knipe.
And I'm Typical Lydia.
And you've been listening to Dead Air.